Cool. All right. So, hey everyone. We're back today with Cory. She was with us, I think, in October or something. We recorded another episode together. And yeah, I just thank you for being here again and for your time.
Yes,
So, do you want to introduce yourself again a little bit? Just so
sure.
people know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's great to be back here. I'm Cory. My professional history is as a psychotherapist turned sex, love, and relationship coach. And my specialty and sort of field of somewhat obsession is trauma and the neurobiology of trauma and how it impacts our every aspect of our life, really, in so many ways, and truly drives the subconscious part of our experiences, right? So that's, I think, probably what has magnetized us together here today for this podcast. And yeah, I'm really excited to drop in. I told Katya I listened to our first episode again, and I really recommend for your listeners to go back and tune into that episode. We covered a lot of ground, a lot of sort of the basic understanding of the role of trauma, how trauma lives in the nervous system, not in the event, right? The impact of these autonomic drives that are so impactful in the ways that we react and respond in our relationships, in our day-to-day lives, and the role of our stress response systems and our attachment systems as well. So yeah, might be a good idea to go back and tune into that episode to give yourself some more foundation if you missed it. I'm really excited to drop in and explore this conversation today.
Yes, I'm so curious. And you know what's coming up for me now is like I usually like to talk about or include the aspect of like the more subtle aspects of trauma, because like when we think of trauma we often think of violence or like just really like epic events, but because I think I'm one of those people who experience trauma in these more subtle ways, in where you would say, oh, but like your childhood was totally fine, like what are you complaining about? So I really like to maybe ask you to just elaborate again on what can actually be traumatic, or what is traumatic to our bodies, to our nervous system. And because to me it's a lot of just like not being able to express ourselves freely and emotionally freely in this society. This is like what I experienced a lot. So just if you could also elaborate on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about the whole field of trauma, right, and what creates trauma in the nervous system to begin with, right? Because it isn't necessarily the event, right? The event happens, but then it's past. And so we can categorize trauma into like several different categories, but maybe if we looked at the two most broadest categories, we could look at shock trauma, which is, I think, what you're describing, right? When you talk about like an event, a catastrophe, a natural disaster, even child abuse, can be considered in its extreme forms, right? Sexual abuse, physical abuse, even neglect. These are forms of shock trauma. But then we have another category of trauma, which goes largely, I think, misunderstood and really normalized in our culture in some ways, which we can describe as developmental trauma or interpersonal trauma, right? Some people describe it as attachment trauma. And this is a much broader field. This is, if you've done any kind of research or study inquiry into the whole realm of complex trauma, right? This is really what we're talking about when we're talking about complex trauma. And I've heard it described, the difference between shock trauma and developmental trauma, is developed trauma is kind of like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? It's these little these little things that accumulate over time, that happen over and over again, right? And they happen within the relationship a lot of times, right? So within our relationship with our primary caregivers in childhood, but it can also happen peer to peer, right? Bullying is a hugely impactful form of interpersonal trauma that has really been normalized in a lot of communities, right? Boys will be boys, and, you know, just toughen up, and you should get used to this, right? And we talked a little bit in the previous episode about this distinction between our autonomic stress response system and our autonomic attachment system. And those two are often at odds with one another in these developmentally traumatizing experiences. So I described this last time, but I'll just briefly talk about it again, right? When the threat, that the piece of this interpersonal experience that's threatening to us, right, is also the piece that we are seeking to connect with. So let me get more specific here. We can think about it a lot with parents and children, but I want to just keep with this peer-to-peer example of bullying, right? So when we're age 6 to 12, developmentally speaking, we're in a social emotional period of development that's very peer focused, right? We shift away from this more sort of egocentric, self-centered, family-centered development in the early years to becoming very focused on our peer group, right? We want to
belong.
Yes, we want to belong. We want to be liked and accepted and revered by our peers. We want to emulate them, right? We're trying on different identities. And when that same group is also poking fun at us sometimes, right? Publicly humiliating us. Again, it creates this push-pull where I need to belong to this group to feel a sense of my really safety, because you know, I think from a logical standpoint, a lot of us don't understand that for our bodies, there's not a difference between a real and imagined threat, right? So we can know, rationally speaking, well, those kids are jerks, right? That popular group is really misusing this child and, you know, being super manipulative, and it would be better for them to reject that group, right? And go out on their own. But we're social creatures, right? We're deeply wired to abandon actually our survival system in order to belong, because to be rejected from the pack does mean death if we go back even just a few hundred years, right? You know, so it's better to stay with a sense of belonging and connection to the group, even though you're getting beat up or you're being humiliated and you don't know when it's going to happen again. At least, you know, on some very deep level, you'll survive, right? And so this is just the way that we're wired, you know, and it really creates a lot of internal disconnection, dissociation, right? Dissociation is one of the biggest factors that determines whether an individual will develop a trauma response from a traumatic event, right? The higher your levels of dissociation, the more likely you are to experience pathological levels of a trauma response in your system, chronic trauma. And a lot of those, that dissociation got laid down very early in life, right? The structural dissociation that we talked about in the last episode, where right, you have to, your body is at war. The attachment system wants to stay connected. The survival system wants to flee. One body can't do two things at the same time. And so we dissociate. And it can happen really early in life. We can inherit it epigenetically, right? Some of these tendencies to dissociate. So it's so complex, but it's really an invitation again to have compassionate, kind of mindful awareness of ourselves, and to say, wow, there's a lot here that maybe seemed very normal, right? The mean girl dynamics I experienced in middle school, you know, yeah,
so
we see it in
common.
TV, we see it in movies. It's really normalized and it's just a part of it, but it's also really impactful. And if you're a kiddo who has early childhood developmental trauma with your attachment figures, with your primary caregivers, you're going to be all the more at risk of, more traumatization in those middle school years.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And I was also recording an episode with Marina a few months
Mm-hmm.
ago, and she was saying the term of a pandemic of disembodiment that's in place in our society, and I just so feel that. And I think like that's basically the dissociation you're talking about. We're just like not really living in our bodies. And from my observations, that just simply comes from, as young kids, we're already being like kind of pushed into a scheduled day, and we have to eat at certain times, and we have to go to school, and then there is also the emotional side of things where we just like learn not to be too angry and not to cry too much. So that creates a disruption in the body as well, right? Because we have to like suppress what we're feeling in order to just like please the people around us again, or create harmony in quote unquote harmony. So
Absolutely.
that I just wanted to bring that as well, because that's what I see so much in the world, and I just want to like shed light on that.
Yes.
As we
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. So from a tiny age, right, we're told you can't have a tantrum in the grocery store.
Yeah.
And it's not so black and white. I don't think the answer is like let your children just, have a tantrum in the middle of the road, right? They could get hit by a bus.
Yes.
I mean, that's why I say these things are complex. There's not a clear black and white answer. But you're right. We do need to give more space for our emotional bodies, right? This is I think a big piece where we disconnect from the soma, from sensation in the body, this living, breathing, dynamic animal body that we all occupy. And we really are sort of taught when we're allowed to feel certain feelings, and how we don't even really distinguish for children the difference between behavior and emotion. These are two different things, right? We say, stop screaming, right? But there's an emotion that's driving the behavior of screaming. And if we can actually acknowledge that and name it for our children and help them to understand, like, yes, I'm an emotional being, right? So often we're just really behavior focused and not as much emotion focused, right?
Right. So true. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then what happens, I think a lot of times what happens is we learn to disconnect from our emotional bodies, and then in turn our physical bodies so much. And then our physical bodies, right, are being objectified, and there's all this meaning that's, socially speaking, being ascribed to our physical form, that we almost even, some of us go to war with our bodies, right? To try to control our bodies, control our emotional bodies, which feel just so out of control. And then we become adults, and, for a lot of more monogamous leaning folks, we get into intimate partnerships, and it's like, all of that suppressed content is like right up in our face. And I don't think it's particularly, I don't know. I mean, here we have high rates of divorce, right? Really long-term partnerships are more, they're less common than not. But at the same time, I don't feel like it's really normalized what is required in terms of social and emotional intelligence and reconnecting with our bodies. We don't understand that that's the missing link to being able to maintain long-term partnerships, whether monogamous or polyamorous, right? Like, these are all relationships. Like, it requires us to dig deep and to be with ourselves and our truth. And so much of that subconscious content is playing out as soon as you get intimate with someone, and it's the same stuff that we were told to shut up and sit down and put our hands in our laps and,
Right.
smile. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, let's talk about relationship. Like, I'm wondering how much you have to say on this, like, the initial, like, pink glasses phase of the relationship where we're just like, oh my God, he's the one, and I'm feeling all the things. And I'm hoping now that you can share more about this, because I heard this often, but don't know much about it, that in the beginning when we meet another person, they're usually like triggering these subconscious needs within us, and usually in a way where we're just like projecting the, oh my God, this person is the one mentality. And then after the 6 to 12 months phase, there's like all this other stuff coming up where we're like, what am I actually doing with this person? So can you elaborate on that?
Yes, well, there's different theories, right? But I think one that really fits what you're describing is this idea of, the shadow self and our lost selves, right? And so even potentially that honeymoon phase, the first 6 months or so of a relationship, when you are with this person and they really feel like they complete you, right? Even if you just look at the language around it, oh, this person completes me, right? And in essence, they reflect my lost parts that I left behind, right? In second grade, when I was humiliated for being a class clown or making a joke, and everyone laughed at me, and the teacher, disciplined me in front of the group. And I decided it wasn't okay for me to be playful, and jovial in public settings. And now I'm 25 and I meet this really playful, jovial human, and I just fall madly in love. And it's not necessarily there is potentially an element of it that is unique to that other person, but a large part of that falling in love is I'm falling back in love with myself. Those parts of me that I left behind and forgot were there even, right? But then what happens, maybe, with humility, I want to explain this story because it's just an inquiry, I think, for all of us to explore. It's true for me, as it's true in my relationship. So one way to think about what happens then is after the honeymoon phase, we start to realize that, well, maybe not consciously, but our subconscious parts begin to realize that this is a different person. This is not, just my jovial, playful, lost part of myself, right? And so those projections start to kind of break down because I am dealing with another autonomous human being, right? Who has their own complex, configuration of parts and lost parts and shadow parts. And so we start to feel the disconnection that's there, right? And we also start to really feel the false selves that have come up and been developed to replace, I guess, in some ways, those lost parts. They start to rear their ugly head. And then this is what I hear from people is like, I hate who I am when I'm with this person, right? I hate who they make me be. I don't like myself when I'm with them. Well, in some ways, we could reflect, so you're being intimate with this person, right? You're getting to see all your sides. But we so often immediately flip into this relationship is wrong. And there's, again, it's not so black and white. Like it may be a really dysfunctional relationship. And, it may be that this isn't the partnership to really deepen in and start to do the work of looking at ourselves. But I think it is important to recognize that maybe that is part of what it means to be an intimate partnership.
Yeah.
Is getting really intimate with those parts of ourselves we don't like, that we don't want to see or feel, and to recognize that they're going to get reflected if we are truly opening up and connecting with another human. We're gonna uncover some of that uncomfortable content.
Yeah, that's so true. Like the other person is an absolute mirror. And I guess I'm so grateful for having done the Vida program and learning about relationships, because otherwise I would have left and just carried my shit to the next door. So I think it is so powerful to know about these things, and then we probably stick around longer than we would have, and see what can be worked through with this person. And maybe it's not for the rest of our lives, but I guess there is so much healing that we can do in partnership.
Yes, exactly. All that the attachment trauma heals in relationship.
Yeah.
So there is the relationship with self, right? That's like maybe the first relationship. And that's where I really love to work with my clients, right? Is with all these parts, the inner child parts. There can be many of them, those inner adolescents that bring so much color to our lives, right? All the perpetrator parts, the victim parts, like there are so many, like Tantra teaches that we have the universe inside of ourselves. And I really find this to be true. So if, if you see something in someone else that you think, oh my word, never, ever, I can't even understand, that's maybe a reflection in and of itself. But yes, I agree. I don't think there's anything necessarily better or worse about, staying in a relationship. Again, it's not so black and white.
Yeah.
With the relationship with self, sometimes it's truly like meeting myself to actually say, no, I'm going to put my foot down and leave this. This is not a healthy relationship, and it's not healing. It's actually re-traumatizing. I keep finding myself, right, in this cycle of abuse, and I need to show up for myself and make the change that's leaving. It's a really important piece of it. And you're right. There's so much to be gained from deepening in, right? I've been with my partner since 2003. So like 18 years now. And, it's such a mixed bag. Like it doesn't look pretty. I mean, we have I think a really healthy, wonderful relationship. I'm probably more in love with him than I ever have been.
Awesome.
Right. But the only thing I think that has kept us together is that we've both really committed to making our relationship, a place for personal development, and to look at our stuff and to heal together. And again, sometimes it looks really, really
weird.
It doesn't look, so like, nice and neat and right. It looks sloppy, but
I think like one thing that you also said, like the relationship, a place of personal development. And I guess that's like so far what I see from my partner and myself, and then from other people, I think it's really important, if you want to keep it going, that both parties are really up for this journey of looking at their stuff and looking at themselves honestly. I feel like otherwise it's going to be really difficult to go on harmoniously together.
And that also doesn't, 18
doesn't
years
guarantee
in. All right. Well, and I'll say too, even when both parties are committed to that, sometimes it just takes one person, I remember we had a couples therapist years and years ago who said, it only takes one of you to start over, but somebody has to do it, right? Like somebody has to be willing to take that step. And I hear her voice a lot in my head, when we're going at it and just like butting heads, right? It's like, okay, maybe he's not willing. Well, it's so glaringly
Yeah.
obvious to me what his part is in this, right? But maybe it's because I can see this right now, because I'm resourced enough to say, wow, this is a really fucked up dynamic. Maybe that is also indication that I can take that first step toward repair.
Yeah.
Toward letting it go, setting it down, reconnecting, and trusting that like we can develop something, a foundation of connection and safety and stability to where then we can come back to this issue. I talked about it in our last episode, but I really have this, like, I'm like a moth to the flame. If there's some form of disconnection in a relationship, it's one of my superpowers, right? I like sniff it out immediately, but it's also a real detriment in my intimate relationships because sometimes you need to take a break, right? You need to not try to resolve it all right now. Right. And shift the focus. So yeah.
That is so funny. That's like, that reminds me of in one of the books we read, it's like the wave and the island. Like the wave always just wants to resolve it immediately. And I'm like more the island person. So I'm also like, just like, let me take a breath first. And it's sometimes you just gotta literally just find ground again first and let some of the heat like fall off, and then you can communicate more clearly again as well.
Yes.
So cool.
Yeah.
Do you have something else to say on all this?
I do. There's a concept that I learned in emotionally focused couples therapy that says, right, there's a difference between the process and the content. So bear with me for a moment, right? This is, I think, where couples so often, and just relationships in general, get really stuck, right? We get stuck in the content. Like you left your dirty dishes in the sink again.
Oh my God.
That's the content, right? But there's a deeper process that's actually driving what is triggering all of, because who cares that there's a dirty dish in the sink, right? That's not actually creating the anger and rage that's coming up. I mean, it feels very real. It feels like it is the dirty dish, but the dirty dish is often just symbolic for the deeper process, which is maybe my partner doesn't show up and carry their weight in this relationship, right? Or my partner doesn't see me and my needs and validate them, right? So those are the deeper processes. And that's part of the trick to slowing down and being able to reconnect, is being able to relinquish the power struggle that's very content focused, right? Who said what? What is the content really of what this fight is about, or this disconnection? And be able to track, what are these deeper processes? What are the deeper unmet needs that are coming up? And creating all of this emotional reactivity, this desire to just flee and give up, right? Or this itch to like attack. And when we can start to get to know the deeper processes in our relationship, then we can become allies for the relationship itself, right? Which is the beauty of Stan Tatkin's work, what you're referencing there, right? Wired for Love, where he describes anxious and avoidant attachment as the waves on the island. And I don't particularly love necessarily this term, but he talks about the couple bubble, right? That there's this like third entity of the relationship. And that as we start, to me, that's the couple bubble, which if he ever listens to this podcast, like, please just change that term. It's so hard to talk to people
funny. It doesn't
it.
resonate with me either, but my partner loves it.
Oh yeah, well, good. Then I'm glad if it works for some people. I always feel really silly talking about it, but it is a great concept, right? That to me, that encompasses like all of these larger processes, right? The space between us. I'm an individual, my partner is an individual, but then there's a third entity, which is the relationship. Right. And as we start to tend to the relationship and track these themes in the relationship, then we can detach from like, oh, it's not about me and it's not about my partner. It's about this other entity, right? And we can work
Yes.
together to start to shift that. And it doesn't become this push-pull kind of power struggle between two individuals.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I noticed that we just had, my boyfriend and I had a couple of weeks ago something similar, and I like, it got so ridiculous where we were just literally just blaming and shaming each other, where I thought, wow, I had no idea that I could even still go into this state of
Yeah.
being or acting. And then I said to him, you know, I think we're just being frustrated about something else, actually, which was pretty clear already, which it was. And we're just like throwing that shit at each other because we're like the only people around right now. And as I said that, I already started crying and started like feeling what I actually wanted. And I said, you know, what I really want is actually just like hug you right now.
Yes.
And as we did that, we started giggling about each other and how ridiculous this is. And
Yeah.
we just said, okay, like we are actually much better off dealing with this frustrating outside circumstance together,
Yeah.
and just like being gentle with each other again. And that was so beautiful to break that pattern of, yeah, of trying to solve it by being angry at somebody else, but actually realizing we are allies. And it feels just so much more nurturing to hold strong together and to
Yes.
go through it together. That was so
Yes.
beautiful. And
Oh,
dropping righteousness is like a big one for me. Like whenever I'm trying to what's the word I'm looking for, like to get my point to be the best,
yeah.
I know that something's off.
Mm-hmm. Yes, totally.
That's usually a good pointer, that when you're just trying to be right, you are like not quite on the path of love.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. I love that. And was that, I'm
Yeah.
curious for you, was that the sort of alarm, or was that where you were able to catch yourself and make that shift when you saw yourself kind of digging your heels in and needing to be right?
Yes. So it was, in that particular experience, it was quite intense. And
Mhm.
I noticed that there was, for like, it was going on for like 20 minutes or half an hour. And there was a time where I just wanted my partner to meet me, to say to me, yes, I understand you, or yes, I'm sorry. But he was just like not giving it to me.
Mhm.
and and that was when I understood, like, I have to understand myself and what I really want. And I actually, what I really want here is gentleness and connection. Like, I
Mhm.
love what one teacher of mine said: every conflict is actually a cry for deeper intimacy.
Yeah.
And that has proven to be true every
Mhm.
time, really. So when the friction is really intense, and I'm glad, because I noticed that my ego gets exhausted quite quickly these days. So I'm just like, you know what? Like, fuck this. We're here to do better. We're here
Mhm.
to transmute this stuff. So let's see what we can do. And sometimes it works really gloriously, and sometimes there's still some residue that needs to be like softened through. Like gentleness is really often what I feel is a path.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have play fights as well.
That's beautiful. Those
Yeah.
are such amazing examples of
Mm.
developing resiliency in your relationship, right? Which
Mhm.
I try. It's like a commitment for me never to talk about trauma without talking
Mhm.
about resilience, because they're
Ah,
one and
yeah.
of the same, right? And it's kind of like, I don't know, if trauma and is like the shadow part, then resiliency is the light side
Yeah.
of that, right?
Yeah.
And this is, the place that we can gain from all this work, right, is developing more resiliency. And so it becomes the goal is not so much, I mean, what I'm hearing from you, it's not so much that we don't fight, right? It's finding ways that we can begin to catch ourselves and create more connection in these spaces of disconnection.
Yeah. Yes. And exactly. Because I think in the past, the fights used to end in disconnection. Yeah. And to me now, when they're coming up, it's like the chance to change that pattern or to close that cycle and bring it into connection. Yes. So it's what I essentially aim for. Yeah.
Which is what I heard you do internally, right? If our experience is created from this myriad of relationships, right? And maybe at its most, at a subtler form, there's the relationship with self. Then when you feel that anger and that righteousness come up, right? The need to be right, to be acknowledged in your rightness. Right? Like what I heard you say was I paused and I felt deeper, right? There's an unmet need that's coming up from inside of me that has the opportunity, when I actually acknowledge that and name it and bring it into consciousness, it's the source of repair and connection, right? But it's also the piece that, as long as I'm projecting my own internal disconnection with my unmet needs outward, I'm creating conflict and disconnection.
Exactly.
One and not the same, right?
So, yes. And what I also just want to say is, when I'm in that situation or in that mode of wanting to be understood, I'm expecting my partner to be like this perfect, unconditionally loving being. And I don't see in that moment that he's also hurting and wanting me to understand him. Yes. And I think that's so important as well, that like, because I can definitely just say that from personal experience, that I tend to expect my partner to just be that perfect human. And because he is in a lot of ways like holding me so much deeper than anybody has before, I tend to expect that from him all the time. But he just also sometimes needs to be met with understanding and with all that we just talked about. And I think, to me, like, humility is a big one there, to just really see the other person also in their needs that are wanting to be met, and in their pains. So this is so good.
It is. It's so, there's so much hope, not hope in, I don't know. I have
optimism.
There you go. That's a good word for it, right? There's growth opportunity, and there's, the chance to really turn it around and to see that our problems, these places of disconnection in our relationships, are the portals. Right? Yes. They're not really problems to be fixed. Like, they're opportunities to drop in with and to get intimate with.
Cycles to be closed.
Well, and new parts of ourselves and new aspects of our relationship to uncover, right? Like, again, it was that righteousness that actually helped you to connect with the unmet need, right?
It's like a signpost. It's like, here, look. Look down there. So shall we go bring this a little bit into the sexuality part as well? Like, how does all this also play out in how we live our sexuality? Like, what? It's like, bam, the next world.
Yes. Well,
because
speaking of those like lost and shadow parts, right? I mean, so much of our sexuality is rejected, right? From a young age. We don't really fully, in a lot of ways, many cultures don't allow children to be sexually expressed and celebrated, right? And to have that normalized. and again, it's not so black and white, right? Like it's, we need some, I believe that I just have the older I get, the more I'm like, oh, this is so complex, right? When I was young,
Yeah.
I really felt like, come on, these are our bodies. Like we need to be free. And then the older I get, I'm like, yes. And, there is a place for social conditioning. I mean, I'll go that far to say that,
Yeah.
like we have to be able to coexist, and it's maybe not so adaptive as a culture to just have ourselves like whipping out our genitalia, and yet like at the same time we're sexual beings, and we need to create safety and spaces for that to be explored, because otherwise what happens is there's so much shame, right, and so much sort of unconscious and subconscious denial of these very deeply autonomic, meaning that they're not conscious drives, right? They're not something we can control with our mind. They're coming out all kind of sideways, right? Yeah. And then you also live in a human body and in a culture where love and sex, not always, but are often very connected, right? We're picking sexual partners with whom we're also trying to build loving partnerships with. And it gets very complex, right? Because now all that shame and all that denied content is also coming up. And how do we process all of this? And it gets really very complicated very quickly, because, well, let me just say one other thing, which is when you were describing the conflict with your partner, one of the thoughts that I had was, this content, this disconnection comes up actually because your relationship is safe enough for it to come up, right? And so this is really the case when we start looking at sexuality. You begin to develop safety and connection and intimacy emotionally, and all of the sexual dysfunctions start to surface, right? And it's like, and then of course we can very easily go to, oh, this person must not be a match for me because I've just lost my desire. Yeah. Or I can't orgasm with my partner. And we don't recognize maybe that this level of intimacy and vulnerability is actually the trigger. We can go have a one night stand and perform amazingly. But then when it's the partner of 10, 20 years, who knows us through and through.
Even a couple of years.
Yes, totally. Absolutely. Beyond that 6 months. Right? Like honeymoon phase. All this stuff starts to surface.
Oh my God. Yeah. So true. And like, oh my God. I'm wondering, because there's like so many people who feel exactly that, and like I've been in that place myself where like just there's like no desire for sex anymore, and you're just like thinking, oh, there's something wrong with me, or there's this not the person that is supposed to be with me. But it's like actually we're just like reaching a point of opportunity to go deeper within ourselves, to uncover all these cultural conditioning. Like sometimes again it's a more specific trauma of maybe even rape or these kinds of things, and then like I felt in my own body disgust about my genitalia that just it literally felt like it was coming from the women in my family before me. It was really like difficult to explain, but that's what it feels like. I guess we have so much of like sovereignty over our own bodies and about our own pleasure to reclaim there, which is like so big.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what you said brings up a concept that I think is important to consider. I find it really helpful when we're talking, especially about, let's say, developmental trauma, and even, social conditioning, which like you said, right, can create harm in a very similar way. I think that what we more maybe in a mainstream way think of as trauma, right? It's disconnecting ourselves from ourselves, right? And so that the word trauma itself means a wound or a crack, right? And so it's that break from ourself. And so there's a difference between the way that implicit memory is stored and retrieved and experienced from explicit memory, right? And this is maybe part of what's happening when you're experiencing some of these things in your sexual relationship, right? That implicit memories are getting stirred, and it's a sign of your mindfulness practice, honestly, your ability to be aware of these things and track them and stay in your window of tolerance and explore it, that you can even recognize like, wow, this feels so old. One of the cornerstones of implicit memory is that we don't typically have what Dan Siegel calls an euphoric sensation. And that what that word that he kind of made up means is a sense of it being from the past. So implicit memory comes up and we experience it as emotion and sensation in the body, and it feels very present. And this is so often what's happening in our intimate partnerships is we're getting these implicit memories triggered, right? And they're coming up, but it doesn't feel like it's a memory from when I was 1.5. Right. And I was left to cry and shamed on the side of the street. And I like clenched my inner thighs together, and I like held my breath and clenched my pelvic floor, and just got flooded. But now my partner maybe had a tone with me that was the same as my mother. And my body responds, and I get flooded with all of that. And I have this idea on top of all of this that's coming up internally that we should be feeling sexy and connected, right? That expectation is doubling this, right? And all along, I'm essentially having a flashback. It's just, I don't even recognize that this is a memory that's coming up. It just feels like it's happening right now.
Right. And I just feel like confused, and I just think like usually I think it's men and women think like, oh, I'm getting old, sex is just not for me anymore. I think this is like the stories that we try to justify it with.
Yeah. And it's so often like, even when I was working in mental health and working with shock trauma, it would be many of my clients came to me when they retired. So let's say they were in the police department, right, for 30 years, didn't have any symptoms of PTSD, but then they retired, and now they're like supposed to be relaxed. They're financially stable in their life, right? And all of a sudden they can't sleep. They're fighting with their partner who they've been with the whole time and had a fairly stable relationship, right? And they came into therapy like, what the heck happened, right? And it was like, oh, you finally relaxed enough that all of this content could come up, right? And it's that way too when we get into and develop like intimate relationships and we start to explore our sexuality with our partners. It's like we're beginning to create this realm of safety and connection with these deeper parts of ourselves, and we don't realize that safety and love and belonging, while they're these beautiful ingredients that create thriving, the process of that is, as you begin to create that in your life, all of the wounding starts to come up. Right. And so, it's so helpful for me to explain to my clients, like, there's a function in this dysfunction, right? Whether it's that you can't get an erection or you've totally lost your libido, right? But it's a sign actually maybe that you're on the right path. Like things are getting worse because you're moving in this direction. And so really bringing a level of curiosity and honor to these things that feel like my body is just not cooperating, right? We can feel so powerless in our, especially sexuality, right? It's so not thought driven. I mean, we can obviously have pathways that are linked with certain ways of thinking, but it's very body driven. So yeah, it's important to recognize that symptoms start to come up when we begin to create safety, when we begin to connect with our sexuality. And it's not that we're taking 5 steps back, even though it feels that way.
Yeah.
It's that we're creating the safety and we're connecting with this stuff so it can come to the surface.
Yeah. I also love about what you're saying that, when the stability is in place to a certain degree, it can seem like our libido is disappearing. But what I also find is that almost like the voice of our body gets louder, and our body shows us that it doesn't want to have this rushed sexual experience anymore, actually. Like this whole quickie and fucking and doing it fast and just having this blow off, it's like it's not sustainable for our bodies. And I think men as well as women need this deeper sense of there's somebody who's taking time to hold me, to caress me, to feel me, and to really be there with me and for me, and for the body to relax and open up. And isn't it that the erection comes from parasympathetic activity, or is it the other way around?
Right. Well, I mean, it's a bit oversimplified, but we can say that sexual arousal is more ventral vagal, right? The socially connected part of our parasympathetic nervous system, right? Not the dorsal vagal. That's the part of the parasympathetic nervous system that throws us into freeze and collapse, but the ventral vagal, right? That part that is relaxed and safe and oriented presently, right? That's the piece that starts to wake up arousal, sexual interest, and orgasm itself is a sympathetic nervous system behavior, right? And so this is why one of many reasons why I'm really, really fascinated and I love working with sexuality, because it requires us to really, what I describe as ride the wave of the nervous system, right? Activating up into our sympathetic, right? Fight, flight, that more activated nervous system response. That's the space of orgasm. And then to come back down. So the practice of edging is a beautiful example of riding the wave, right? Building pleasure, activating, building up, getting to the edge of orgasm, and then relaxing and softening and coming back down. And that's why, that is such a why that's such a powerful practice for people to explore, whether you want to last longer, whether you want, multiple orgasms. There's so many things to be gained from a practice with edging, right? With not just going straight to orgasm as the goal, right? Cool. Like you were saying, the speed, pop off and be done, but like learning to ride that wave, to turn the dial back down, get back in your body, and then build it back up and then slow it back down. This is where we can learn actually a tremendous amount of nervous system regulation. I think it goes far beyond sexuality. If we are open to this as a portal of really getting to know our nervous systems and integrating it into our everyday life, into our emotional regulation, like it's a beautiful space to really learn to connect with our bodies and our nervous systems, and this natural activation and deactivation, working with pleasure, which in so many ways is the antidote to trauma, to, these patterns that we're so habituated in with our stress response system. So.
Wow. So edging is a great way to recalibrate the nervous system as well, and to come into a more generally relaxed state is what you're saying.
And also, right, to actively, I mean, I'll just use some trauma lingo here to like widen the window of tolerance. We often think about the window of tolerance when it comes to like distressing experiences, right? Maybe I have a really narrow window of tolerance when it comes to frustration, right? And I just go flying off the handle the minute I get a little bit frustrated. But what we don't realize is that developmental trauma, particularly, and all forms of trauma, really decrease our window of tolerance for pleasure, for positive emotions, right?
Yeah.
And so edging is one of those that actually increases, like, oh, I can have more pleasure, right? I can build and build more of this sensation in my body, and I can handle it. I don't have to just, I mean, I'm not saying that orgasm is necessarily like leaving your window of tolerance, but there can be a dissociation, with that, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a beautiful way to, in real time, start to stretch that window of tolerance, to be able to tolerate more pleasure, be able to stay connected to our bodies, to be able to, relax, take a deep breath, and then turn up the volume again, right? Stay connected with the partner. And if we could more center practices like that as, maybe the point of our sexual interactions, rather than just getting off. This is really an incredible window and doorway into deepening our sexuality, our experience of pleasure in our body, orgasmic states, right? Connection with our partners. And like you were saying, like, these sexual encounters with other people are such amazing spaces to get to know ourselves and others more deeply. There's so much more than just orgasm to be gained. And there's so many more forms of orgasm to uncover when you can start to increase your window of tolerance and build more pleasure and, be in deep, connection with the other.
And that is so powerful, because I also had to learn that, like, my body wants to feel connected and not just have sex. And so there is like such a huge field of play where we can connect without the actual penetration, and just like exploring the bodies. And that's where I just love this tantric or conscious sexuality coming into play, because it gives us so many tools of working with the breath and working with sensitizing ourselves all over, and just like spreading the pleasure all over the body. And that is just like such powerful tools to play with, and to take this focus of this rigid fucking with orgasm, and just really unfolding more into the beauty of our whole selves, of this universe that we are.
Pleasure really is the point, right? I mean, this whole podcast has the orientation of being focused on the role of trauma, right? And I would say, like, that this is, I think, the next frontier perhaps for people looking and researching and talking about trauma, is recognizing that it's not so much about the pain. Maybe, right? It's actually about the pleasure, right? And that's where the real healing is. And we talked about this in the last episode, but if stabilization is your goal, I would say maybe you're even missing the point, because you haven't gotten the whole way through that sequencing that stress cycle into the ecstatic pleasure that comes from actually surviving these traumas, right? And what that feels like in our bodies, and recognizing that we really have, as a larger society and culture, super narrow windows of tolerance for pleasure. You're allowed to experience pleasure in some very specific ways for limited periods of time, right? It's the dessert course at the end of the day. It's the like 2 weeks of vacation you get a year or whatever, right? It's like this tiny portion. But maybe like true healing and liberation comes from, like, what if it was 2 weeks of pain and the rest pleasure? Like, we do need to feel the pain and look at it and talk about it and begin to relate to it differently. But the point is the pleasure, beginning to
Mm-hmm.
center that, beginning to tolerate it, beginning to explore it as its own portal. We really live in a problem focused, pain focused culture. And yeah, this is why I think sexuality and trauma healing really are connected in some big ways, beyond just, you know, for sexual assault survivors, you know, people who've directly experienced trauma in their sexuality. It's true maybe for all of us, certainly, you know, as beings with attachment systems and, you know, sexual organs and all our variety of orientations and how we experience pleasure and connection and love and belonging. But sexuality is a huge piece of it. So
yeah, that's amazing. Like, I just also want to say, like, when we start expanding into pleasure, it's like we're holding the torch of light into ourselves, and that automatically also brings or like shows us the dark and hidden parts. So it's like this, I don't know what in the trauma world they use. There's a special word, this titillation or something like this.
Pendulation.
Pendulation. Yes, where you're just like going in and out, and by that, yeah, it's like also the edging what you explained. And so I think that's, yeah, to learn to play with that and be with that. I feel like it's almost another podcast in itself, because but maybe we leave it at that it's that's why sexuality and pleasure is also so triggering often, why we can maybe feel like super turned on, and as you said earlier, our partner just like moves in a certain way and our body remembers something and shuts down. And I just maybe want to like normalize that by saying this here, that this is because of what you shared and that it's totally normal. And I think it's really important that we learn to hold ourselves in that, or to ask from our partner to be with us in it. So I really found personal work with these tender parts of myself. They're really, really helpful, that I don't feel like completely overwhelmed. I can still feel overwhelmed, but I still know what is happening. So I can still be a bit more relaxed about it, or okay with it. So I think, yeah, that's so useful to learn to hold ourselves first, or to see these parts of ourselves first, and then we can also in relationship and sex much more, like, easily sounds a bit weird, but much better share ourselves in this vulnerable state with another, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Cool.
Absolutely. Oh, I just love talking with you.
Yes, I really enjoyed it. This was so good. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Is there anything else you want to say to finish off? But I think we're,
just that if you're struggling, you know, if anyone in your audience is struggling with their sexuality, with relationship, you know, I think what I want to end with is just that it's okay, right? That these are, again, like, perhaps not these horrible problems to be fixed, but that they really are the invitations for growth, right? That they're actually the solutions to our problems, waiting for us to slow down, like you said, to take a pause and to honor these spaces, to say, wow, okay, here's a piece of magic that I'm experiencing as, like, you know, the biggest pain and problem in my life. But if I can just see that there's a really beautiful opportunity, that there's something really that's worthy and deserving of deep honor and reverence in this experience, in my body, in my emotional body, right, in my psyche, however it's showing up, the more we can bring that, like, humility and then reverence to those places, the more quickly we'll heal, the more quickly we'll begin to transform those spaces and feel the power that's in that pain, right? That's in that space of disconnection that can deepen the intimacy. Yes.
I love that. Thank you. Our blockages are information. I think that.
Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing this, and for the heads up in the end. That's so important, I think, as well. So Let's leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time, Cory.
Yes, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.